this house! Ah!
Hello, I need help.
After taking her son and his manipulative wife into her home, a mother is cruelly thrown out onto the street like trash. Her son screams, "This is our house now," as he changes the locks. He has no idea that his mother's one quiet phone call to her lawyer is about to turn his castle into a living nightmare, ending with him on his knees, begging for the mercy he never showed. Hello everyone, and welcome back. This story is a tough one, but one that needs to be told. Before we get into it, please show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. When my son, Scott, and his wife Brenda lost their apartment, my front door was the first one they knocked on. Of course, I let them in. My house, a quiet 3-bedroom colonial I had shared with my late husband for 40 years, felt too big and too silent for just one person. The thought of having family under my roof again, of hearing laughter in the hallways, filled me with a joy I hadn't felt in a long time. "Just for a few months, Mom," Scott had said, hugging me, "just until we get back on our feet." I waved his worries away. "This is your home," I told him. "Stay as long as you need." I had no idea that he would take those words as a transfer of title. The first month was wonderful. It was a return to a life I thought I had lost. We had dinner together every night. I taught Brenda my husband's favorite recipes. Scott would tell me about his day at work. It felt like a family again. But slowly, subtly, the atmosphere began to change. The shift started with small things. Brenda began rearranging my living room furniture while I was out, explaining it with a saccharine smile. "It just has a better flow this way, don't you think?" She started, helpfully, reseasoning my cooking when she thought I wasn't looking. Then came the whispers. I would walk into a room and find her and Scott in a hushed conversation that would abruptly stop the moment they saw me. A cold, unsettling feeling began to creep into the corners of my happy home. The whispers grew into suggestions, all channeled through my son. "Mom, Brenda was thinking maybe we could turn the guest room into a home office for her. She needs a dedicated space." "Mom, Brenda feels like your old china is a bit dated. Maybe we could put it in storage and get something more modern." Each request was a small territorial claim, a flag planted in the soil of my life. I was slowly being relegated to the status of a guest in my own house. The worst part was seeing the change in Scott. My kind, thoughtful son was becoming tense and irritable, his conversations with me short and dismissive. He was a puppet, and I could see his wife's hand pulling the strings. The breaking point came over something laughably trivial, a rose bush. My prize-winning heirloom rose bush by the front porch, the one my husband had planted for me on our 10th anniversary. Brenda announced one morning that she wanted to rip it out to plant a Zen garden with bamboo and white stones. I refused. It was the first time I had put my foot down. I said, "No, Brenda, that rose bush stays." She didn't argue. She just gave me a cold, tight smile and went to find my son. An hour later, Scott confronted me in the living room. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim resolution. Brenda stood just behind him, a look of vindictive satisfaction in her eyes. "Brenda feels that you're not giving us the space to make this house our own," he began, reciting the lines she had clearly fed him. "She feels like she's walking on eggshells. We're a family now, and this is our home, but you're still treating it like it's just yours." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Scott," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "this is my house." He shook his head, a look of pitying frustration on his face. "That's the problem. You're not getting it. We can't start our future with you constantly looking over our shoulder." He took a deep breath, and the words he said next shattered my world. Brenda and I think it's time for you to find somewhere else. A small apartment, maybe. A retirement community. We need the house to ourselves now. This is our house now." He said it so calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. I was being evicted. From my own home, by my own child. Before I could even process the monstrousness of his words, he was walking to my bedroom. He came back a few minutes later with an overnight bag he had packed with a few of my things. He opened the front door and placed the bag on the porch. "I think it's best if you go now," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We'll forward your mail." Then he closed the door in my face. I heard the deadbolt click shut. I stood on the porch of the home I had lived in for 40 years, with nothing but a small bag and the cold, stunning realization that I was homeless. I've only just begun this story, but believe me, it's about to get even more intense. Stay tuned to find out what happens when the hero faces an even greater injustice. For a long time, I just stood there on the cool flagstones of the porch, the small overnight bag at my feet. The world had tilted on its axis, and I was struggling to find my balance. My key, the one that had opened that front door for 40 years, was useless in my purse. My home, filled with my furniture, my memories, my entire life, was now a fortress, and I was the enemy who had been cast out. Through the living room window, I saw the lights flicker on. They were in there now, my son and his wife, probably congratulating themselves on their victory, settling into their new life. The pain was so immense, so physical. It felt like a lead weight in my chest. It wasn't just the loss of my home. It was the brutal, casual cruelty of the betrayal. I had been deemed disposable by my own child. I don't know how long I stood there. 5 minutes? 20? Eventually, the cold night air began to seep through my cardigan, and a survival instinct I didn't know I possessed kicked in. I would not stand here and weep on their doorstep. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I picked up my bag, walked down the driveway one last time, got into my car, and drove away. I had no destination in mind. My friends' houses were out. I was too ashamed, too raw to explain the monstrous thing that had just happened. Instead, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a bleak, anonymous motel off the highway, a place with a flickering neon sign and rooms that rented by the hour. The room was small, smelled of stale cigarette smoke and disinfectant, and the single bed was covered in a thin, scratchy bedspread. I sat on the edge of that bed in that dingy, soulless room, and the full weight of my new reality crashed down on me. I, Diane, a 67-year-old widow who had owned her home outright for 2 decades, was now a refugee in a roadside motel. The tears I had held back finally came, hot and silent. I cried for my late husband, who would be horrified to see what our son had become. I cried for my daughter-in-law's cunning cruelty, but most of all, I cried for the sweet, loving boy I had raised and the weak, callous man he had turned into. I let myself grieve for exactly 1 hour. Then, I washed my face with cold water, looked at my blotchy, tear-stained reflection in the cracked mirror, and made a decision. My son had mistaken my kindness for weakness. He was about to get a lesson in the difference. I pulled out my phone and found the number for my family lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense man named David Chen, who had handled my husband's estate. I had to leave a message with his after-hours service, but I kept my voice perfectly calm and factual. Mr. Chen, this is Diane. I apologize for the late hour. I'm calling to report that I have been illegally evicted from my own property by my son Scott, who is currently occupying the house with his wife. I require your immediate legal assistance to rectify the situation. I left the number for the motel and hung up. The call came at 8:01 the next morning. Diane? David Chen's voice was sharp with disbelief and outrage. I just got your message. Please tell me I misunderstood. I calmly recounted the events of the previous evening, from the argument over the rose bush to the bag on the porch and the click of the deadbolt. I heard him take a deep, angry breath on the other end of the line. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice simmering with fury on my behalf. "This isn't just a family squabble, Diane. This is illegal. What they've done is called a wrongful eviction, and they are currently trespassing on your property." I felt the first real flicker of strength return to me. I wasn't just a homeless old woman. I was a property owner whose rights had been violated. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We don't do anything soft, Diane," he said, and I could hear the grim smile in his voice. "We don't send a warning letter. We act. I am immediately filing a petition for a temporary restraining order and a formal eviction notice. I will have a process server and a sheriff's deputy at your house by 3 o'clock this afternoon." They thought they had a new home. By dinner time today, they will have a court date and a legal order to vacate the premises immediately. The words were a balm to my wounded soul. The countdown had begun. The hours leading up to 3 p.m. were the longest of my life. I met Mr. Chen at a coffee shop near my house, where he bought me a cup of tea and walked me through the documents one more time. He was a rock of professional calm, and his confidence was contagious. "You are the victim here, Diane," he told me firmly. "Do not let them make you feel otherwise. We are not being aggressive. We are simply re-establishing the legal reality." At 2:50 p.m., we drove in his car and parked across the street from my house. My house. It looked so peaceful, so normal from the outside. A light was on in the living room. They were in there, comfortable and secure, with no idea the reckoning was about to arrive on their doorstep. Exactly at 3 p.m., a county sheriff's patrol car pulled up quietly behind us. A tall, uniformed deputy stepped out, his face impassive. He met with Mr. Chen for a moment, took the thick envelope of legal documents, and then, with us following at a discreet distance, he walked up the stone path I had swept just 2 days ago. The sound of his firm, official knock echoed on the quiet street. After a moment, the door opened. It was Brenda. She had a glass of wine in her hand, and a look of bored annoyance on her face, as if she were about to scold a pesky salesman. Her expression changed with comical speed. Her eyes went from the deputy's uniform to the legal papers in his hand, and then finally to me and Mr. Chen standing on the sidewalk. The color drained from her face. The wine glass trembled in her hand. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a high-pitched squeak. "Ma'am," the deputy said, his voice polite but firm, "are you Brenda Miller? I am here to serve you and your husband, Scott Miller, with a temporary restraining order and a notice of eviction." Scott appeared behind her, drawn by the commotion. He saw the deputy, he saw the papers, and he saw me. The look of utter, horrified comprehension on his face was a sight I will not soon forget. Brenda immediately erupted. "You can't do this. This is our house." The deputy didn't flinch. "According to the deed and the property records, ma'am, this house is the sole property of Diane Miller," he said, gesturing towards me. "This order, signed by a judge this morning, requires you and your husband to vacate the premises immediately. You are legally trespassing." Scott just stood there, speechless and pale, but Brenda's shock quickly morphed into a venomous rage directed entirely at me. "You evil old woman!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. You'd really throw your own son out on the street? What kind of mother are you? I didn't say a word. I just stood there on the public sidewalk, watching the drama unfold on the porch of my own home. I didn't have to defend myself. The man with the badge and the legal documents was doing it for me. Mr. Chen stepped forward. My client is the kind of mother who opened her home to you when you had nowhere else to go, he said, his voice cold as ice. And you repaid that kindness by attempting to steal her property. The time for discussion is over. The deputy will now escort you while you pack 1 suitcase each of your essential personal belongings. The rest of your possessions will be inventoried and can be retrieved by a third party at a later date. You have 1 hour. The finality of his words, backed by the silent, imposing presence of the sheriff's deputy, finally broke them. Brenda's shrieking dissolved into choked, impotent sobs. Scott, my son, looked utterly defeated. A man hollowed out by his own weakness and greed. He couldn't even look at me. He just stared at the floor, his face a mask of shame. The deputy followed them inside, leaving the front door open. I stood on the sidewalk and watched as the couple who had thrown me out like trash less than 24 hours ago began the humiliating process of packing their bags to leave, under the watchful eye of the law. My house was almost mine again. Watching my son and his wife carry their single suitcases out of my house and stuff them into their car was one of the strangest, most surreal moments of my life. There was no triumphant feeling, no surge of victory, just a profound, hollow ache. The deputy stayed until their car had pulled away from the curb. Mr. Chen walked through the house with me one last time, making sure nothing was damaged. "The restraining order is in effect," he said, his voice gentle. "They cannot come within 500 feet of you or this property. If they try to contact you, you call me immediately. Do you understand, Diane?" I nodded, though my mind was a million miles away. When he finally left, I was alone. I locked the front door, leaned my forehead against the cool wood, and took my first real breath in my own home. It felt alien, tainted. The first thing I did was open every single window, letting the fresh afternoon breeze chase out the stale air of their presence. I walked through the rooms, taking inventory of the changes they had made in their short, tyrannical reign. My favorite armchair had been moved to a dark corner. The photos of my late husband on the mantelpiece had been pushed behind a large, garish vase Brenda must have bought. In the kitchen, my simple coffee maker had been replaced by a complicated chrome espresso machine I had no idea how to operate. They hadn't just been living in my house. They had been actively erasing me from it. I spent the rest of the day putting things back. I moved the furniture, returned my husband's photos to their rightful place, and with a grim sense of satisfaction, I packed the espresso machine back in its box and put it in the garage. This was my home, and I was taking it back. The first communication came that evening. It was a text message from Brenda. It was as full of venom as I expected. "I hope you're happy, you vindictive old witch. You've made your own son homeless. You'll die alone in that house." I read the words, felt a flicker of the old hurt, and then calmly blocked her number. She was irrelevant, a nasty little footnote in my family's story. The text from Scott started the next day. They were different. The anger was gone, replaced by a panicked desperation. "Mom, please answer. We're staying at a motel. I don't know what to do. Mom, Brenda is blaming me for everything. She said this is all my fault. Mom, I made a mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake. I'm so sorry. Please, just talk to me." On Mr. Chen's advice, I didn't respond. For 7 days, I maintained a complete and total silence. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. The mother in me wanted to rush in, to fix it, to soothe my son's pain, even though he had been the cause of my own. But the woman who had been thrown out of her own house knew better. This was a lesson he had to learn in the silence. He had to sit with the full weight of his actions, with no one to blame but himself and the woman he had allowed to poison his mind. He had to understand what it felt like to have nowhere to go, to have his security ripped out from under him. He had to feel, if only for a week, what he had intended for me to feel for the rest of my life. During that week, something in me shifted. The pain was still there, but it was joined by a sense of clarity and strength I hadn't felt in years. I had allowed myself to become a background character in my own life, a quiet, accommodating presence that could be easily dismissed. That woman was gone. The woman who remained was quieter, yes, but she was made of steel. I knew I would forgive my son eventually. He was my child, and my love for him was a fundamental part of me. But forgiveness and consequences were two different things. He could have my love, but he had lost his right to my home. Exactly 1 week after the eviction, on a Tuesday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I knew who it was. I smoothed down my blouse, took a steadying breath, and walked to the door. I looked through the peephole first. It was both of them, Scott and Brenda, standing on my porch. They looked awful. They were pale, thin, and their clothes were wrinkled as if they had been living out of a suitcase. All the arrogance and defiance had been stripped away from them, leaving behind two desperate, hollowed-out people. I opened the door. Scott looked at me, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was almost tangible. Brenda couldn't even meet my gaze. She just stared at the welcome mat. And then, to my utter astonishment, my son, my tall, proud son, sank to his knees on my front porch. A moment later, his wife followed suit. We are on the verge of the climax. What happens now will turn everything upside down. You simply cannot miss the resolution of this story. I looked down at the two kneeling figures on my porch, and I felt a profound sense of weary finality. The sight of my son, a grown man on his knees before me, brought me no joy. It was a pathetic, tragic tableau that never should have happened. Brenda was the first to speak, her voice a saccharine whine that was even more grating than her previous anger. "Diane, we are so sorry," she began. "We made a terrible mistake. We weren't thinking clearly." Scott cut her off, his own voice thick with a shame that felt far more genuine. "No," he said, looking up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "I made a terrible mistake. I let my own weakness and my stress turn me into a monster. I betrayed you, Mom. I betrayed Dad's memory. I threw away your love because I was too much of a coward to face my own problems. There is no excuse for what I did. I am sorry." His words were the ones I needed to hear, but they were spoken a week too late, and across a chasm of disrespect that could not be so easily bridged. I did not invite them in. I remained in the doorway, a sentinel guarding the entrance to my own life. "I hear your apology, Scott," I said, my voice calm and even, "and I believe it is sincere." I then turned my gaze to my daughter-in-law, who was still kneeling beside him, a look of anxious expectation on her face. "Brenda," I said, my voice turning colder, "I have heard your words as well." I let the sentence hang in the air, a clear dismissal. I would not grant her the gift of my belief. We both knew her sorrow was for the loss of a free house, not for the pain she had inflicted. I looked back at my son. "You are my child, and I will always love you. And because I love you, I forgive you." A wave of visible relief washed over his face, but I held up a hand. "I forgive you for your weakness. But forgiveness and trust are two very different things. Forgiveness is a gift. Trust must be earned back. And that will take a very, very long time. The relationship we had is over. It was built on the flawed assumption that you were a boy I needed to protect and I was a mother you could take for granted. We are not that anymore." I took a deep breath. It was time for the final consequence. "You will not be moving back into this house," I stated, leaving no room for argument. "This house is mine. It was the home I built with your father, and it is the sanctuary you violated. You will never see it as anything other than a prize you tried to claim, so you will not have it." Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp, but Scott just nodded, accepting the verdict as his due. "I will not see you homeless, however," I continued. "I will give you enough money for a security deposit and first month's rent on a small apartment, a new start, one that you will build for yourselves on your own 2 feet. It is the last handout you will ever receive from me. The rest is up to you." I saw the final crushing understanding in my son's eyes. He had been forgiven, but he had not been rescued. He had been given mercy, but not the prize. He had lost his inheritance, his home, and the easy comfort of his mother's unconditional support, all in a single stupid, greedy act. He and Brenda slowly got to their feet, their faces a mixture of shame and defeat. There was nothing left to say. They had gambled, and they had lost everything. They turned and walked away from my porch, not towards a beautiful home that was already paid for, but towards a cramped, rented future they would have to earn for themselves. I watched them go until their car turned the corner and disappeared. Then I stepped back inside and closed my front door, the solid click of the deadbolt, a sound of finality and peace. I was alone in my house once more. But it was no longer tainted. It was no longer a place of betrayal. It was mine, fully and completely. I had been thrown out like trash, but I had returned as the queen of my own castle, and I had set my world right again.